The frozen earth of the Eastern Front didn't give easily. Every shovelful was a battle against permafrost and exhaustion. Yet the German soldiers kept digging. They had learned that survival meant going underground, deep enough to escape the Soviet artillery that turned the landscape into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. But one hole was different. In the winter of 1943, near the ruins of Stalingrad, a young Wehrmacht corporal named Klaus Becker found himself separated from his unit during a chaotic Soviet counterattack. The artillery barrage came without warning, transforming the white expanse into a hellscape of fire and ice. Men screamed, ran, and disappeared into clouds of snow and shrapnel. Klaus dove into the nearest foxhole, a small, insignificant depression in the ground that seemed barely adequate for one man. He didn't know it then, but this hole would become his entire world for the next 72 hours. What happened in that frozen sanctuary would haunt Klaus for the rest of his life. It wasn't the violence he witnessed or the near misses with death that would wake him decades later in a cold sweat. It was something else entirely. Something that challenged everything he thought he knew about war, about humanity, and about the thin line between enemy and brother. This is the story of that hole, that soldier, and the confession he made 50 years after the war ended. It's a story that reminds us that in the vast machinery of war, individual moments of humanity can occur in the smallest, most unexpected places. And sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that take a lifetime to tell.
The Eastern Front of World War II was hell frozen over. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 4 million soldiers died in the conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, a scale of carnage that defies comprehension. The battles were fought not just against enemy soldiers, but against the brutal Russian winter, where temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero and frostbite claimed as many casualties as bullets. In this environment, a foxhole wasn't just a tactical position, it was the difference between life and death. German soldiers called them Schützenlöcher, protective holes, and they dug them obsessively whenever they stopped moving. The standard foxhole was supposed to accommodate 2 or 3 men, providing mutual support and shared warmth. Regulations specified dimensions, drainage considerations, and fields of fire. But theory and reality on the Eastern Front were rarely the same thing. Klaus Becker was 22 years old in January 1943, though he looked 40. The son of a baker from Munich, he had been conscripted in 1941 with dreams of quick victory and glory. Those illusions had died somewhere in the frozen steppes outside Moscow. Now, 2 years into the campaign, he was simply trying to survive each day, each hour, each minute. His unit, the 297th Infantry Division, had been part of the doomed 6th Army at Stalingrad. As the Soviet encirclement tightened, Klaus's regiment had been positioned on the outer defensive ring, theoretically protecting the escape routes that High Command insisted didn't need to be used. When the Soviets finally launched their devastating offensive to split the German forces, chaos erupted along the entire line. The story of Klaus Becker's 72 hours in that solitary foxhole remained largely unknown for decades. He returned to Germany after 5 years in a Soviet prison camp, rebuilt his life, rarely spoke of the war, and carried his secrets quietly. It wasn't until 1995, prompted by his grandson's school project on World War II, that Klaus finally agreed to record his testimony. The interview, conducted over several sessions and preserved in the archives of Munich's Institute for Contemporary History, reveals an extraordinary tale of survival, moral choice, and unexpected humanity in the most inhumane circumstances imaginable. The morning of January 18, 1943 began like any other nightmare on the Eastern Front. Klaus had woken before dawn, his entire body aching from sleeping on frozen ground despite the layers of newspaper he'd stuffed inside his uniform for insulation. The coffee, if the bitter acorn brew could be called that, was lukewarm, and breakfast consisted of a piece of black bread so hard he had to suck on it to soften it enough to chew. Quote, "We knew something was coming," Klaus recalled in his 1995 interview, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of actual coffee, his eyes distant. You could feel it in the air. The Soviet artillery had been quiet for 2 days, which was never a good sign. When they were quiet, they were planning something. Quote, his company commander Hauptmann Weber had ordered them to reinforce their positions. Klaus and his squad mates, Franz, Otto, and the young recruit everyone called Mouse, because of his small size and skittish nature, had spent the previous afternoon strengthening their section of the trench line. They'd worked until their hands bled, even through gloves, piling frozen corpses from previous battles into the earthworks because the bodies provided better protection than sandbags. At 0600 hours, the world exploded. Quote, I had never experienced a barrage like that, Klaus remembered, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We had been shelled before many times, but this was different. It was as if the earth itself was being torn apart. The sound, you didn't hear it so much as feel it in your bones, in your teeth, in your chest cavity. The Soviet Katyusha rockets, which German soldiers nicknamed Stalin's organs for their distinctive howling sound, turned the morning sky into a ceiling of fire. High explosive shells, incendiary rounds, and anti-personnel shrapnel rained down in a symphony of destruction designed to break both positions and spirits. Klaus and his squadmates pressed themselves into the frozen earth, praying to gods most of them had stopped believing in months ago. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it finally lifted, Hauptmann Weber was screaming orders to prepare for the infantry assault. Through the smoke and snow, Klaus could see shapes moving, hundreds of them, Soviet soldiers in winter camouflage advancing across the open ground. Quote, Weber shouted for us to fall back to secondary positions, but there was so much confusion. The trenches were collapsed in places, men were wounded, screaming. Mouse was hit. I saw him go down, clutching his stomach. I tried to reach him, but Otto pulled me back. He said Mouse was gone, that we had to move. In the chaos of the retreat, Klaus became separated from his unit. He ran blindly through the smoke, stumbling over debris and bodies, both German and Russian. The sound of rifle fire was everywhere, impossibly close. He could hear Soviet voices shouting orders, the metallic click of weapons being reloaded. Then another artillery barrage began. Klaus dove for cover, sliding into what appeared to be a shell crater. But as he tumbled downward, he realized it wasn't a crater at all, it was a foxhole, carefully dug and concealed probably by Soviet soldiers before the position changed hands weeks ago. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, but it opened into a small chamber about 6 feet long and 4 feet deep. He landed hard at the bottom, knocking the wind from his lungs. Above him, the world continued to tear itself apart. Shells screamed overhead, impacting so close that dirt rained down through the entrance. Klaus pressed himself against the frozen earth wall, making himself as small as possible, and waited for either the barrage to end or a direct hit to end everything. Neither happened for a very long time. As the minutes stretched into hours, Klaus took stock of his situation. He still had his rifle, though he'd lost his ammunition pouches somewhere during the retreat. A quick check revealed only 8 rounds left. He had his bayonet, his entrenching tool, and a half-empty canteen of water that had frozen into slush. In his pockets, 2 cigarettes, waterproof matches, and a letter from his sister he'd been carrying for 3 months, but couldn't bring himself to read. Most troubling of all, he had no idea where he was. The smoke and snow had disoriented him completely. He could be behind German lines, in no man's land, or even behind Soviet positions. Venturing out to find out seemed suicidal with artillery still falling, but staying put indefinitely wasn't viable. As darkness fell on that first day, Klaus made a decision. He would wait until morning, then carefully reconnoiter his position. If he could determine where the front lines were, he might be able to make it back to friendly forces. If not, well, he tried not to think about the alternatives. He attempted to sleep, but the cold made it nearly impossible. The foxhole provided protection from wind and shrapnel, but the earth itself was frozen solid, leaching heat from his body. He did the exercises he'd learned, tensing and releasing muscles to generate warmth, moving his toes and fingers to prevent frostbite. He thought about Munich, about his mother's bakery, about the smell of bread rising in the early morning. And he tried not to think about Mouse, about the look in the young soldier's eyes as he clutched his ruined stomach. Sometime near midnight, Klaus heard voices speaking Russian. They were close, terrifyingly close. He held his breath, not daring to move, his hand tight around his rifle. Footsteps crunched in the snow above his hiding spot. He could see shadows passing across the narrow entrance of the foxhole, silhouettes against the dim starlight. The voices moved on, and Klaus exhaled slowly. He was definitely behind Soviet lines, or at least in territory they controlled. His chances of making it back had just dropped considerably. As he settled back against the frozen earth, Klaus Becker had no idea that his ordeal had barely begun, or that he was about to have company.
Klaus Becker rarely spoke about the war. Like many veterans, he found that those who hadn't experienced it couldn't truly understand, while those who had preferred not to remember. He rebuilt his life methodically. He worked in his family's bakery, married a quiet woman named Margaret, raised 2 children, and tried to be normal. But the Red Star pin stayed with him. He kept it hidden in a small wooden box in his dresser, taking it out occasionally to look at it, to remember those 3 days in the frozen earth. Sometimes he wondered if Dmitri had made it back to Soviet lines. Sometimes he wondered if his mercy had been rewarded with capture or death. Mostly, he tried not to wonder at all. The years passed. Germany divided, reunified. The Cold War came and went. Klaus's hair turned white. His children had children of their own, and the war became history instead of memory for everyone except those who had lived through it. Then, in 1994, everything changed. Klaus received a letter forwarded through the International Red Cross. It was worn and creased, having apparently been in transit for months. The return address was Smolensk, Russia. With trembling hands, Klaus opened it. The letter was in Russian with a German translation included. It read, "To Corporal Klaus Becker, if you are alive. I do not know if this letter will reach you. I do not know if you survived the war or the long years since, but I have spent 50 years trying to find you, and I must try once more before I die. My name is Dmitri Volkov. In January 1943, you spared my life. I do not know why you let me go from that hole in the ground. By all the logic of war, you should have killed me. I was your enemy, and by letting me live, you put yourself in danger. I want you to know what happened after I left. I made it back to my unit. My arm was treated, though it has never worked properly since. My commanders questioned me about where I had been, what I had seen. I told them I had been unconscious in a ruined building, that I remembered nothing. I did not tell them about you or about the foxhole. I could not repay your mercy with betrayal. I survived the war. I returned to my family's farm. I married, had children and grandchildren. I have lived a full life, a life I would not have had if not for you. I'm old now and sick. The doctors tell me I do not have much time left. But before I die, I needed you to know that your choice mattered. You showed me that even in the worst darkness, there can be light. Even when we are ordered to see only enemies, we can choose to see human beings. I have kept your secret for 50 years. I have never told anyone about the German soldier who showed me mercy. But now I want the world to know that men like you existed even in that terrible time. Thank you, Klaus Becker. Thank you for my life. With respect and gratitude, Dmitri Volkov." Klaus read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Marguerite found him sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread before him, weeping like she had never seen him weep. He wrote back immediately. Over the next year, he and Dmitri exchanged several letters. They shared stories of their lives, their families, the strange paths that had led from that frozen foxhole to old age half a century later. They sent photographs. 2 old men who had once been frightened boys, now grandfathers with kind eyes and weary smiles. Dmitri died in early 1995 before they could arrange to meet in person. His son wrote to inform Klaus and included a request. Dmitri had wanted his story told. He believed that future generations needed to understand that even in war, individual choices mattered, that mercy was possible even when everything argued against it. This was what prompted Klaus to finally break his silence. He agreed to be interviewed by historians, to have his testimony recorded. He brought the Red Star pin and Dmitri's letters. He spoke about the foxhole, about the choice he made, about the cost of war measured not in strategic objectives, but in individual human moments. "People ask me if I was brave," Klaus said during his final interview in 1998, a year before his own death. "I wasn't. I was terrified every moment of those 3 days. But I think maybe real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing to be human, even when fear and war are telling you to be something else." He was asked if he regretted his decision, if he ever wished he had made the practical choice and killed Dmitri when he had the chance. "Never," he replied without hesitation. "That choice in the foxhole, it was the only thing I did during the entire war that I'm proud of. Everything else was just survival or following orders. But that moment, when I let Dmitri go, that was me. That was Klaus Becker making a choice that mattered." The interviewer asked one final question. "What do you want people to learn from your story?" Klaus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "I want them to know that we are never just soldiers or enemies or Germans or Russians or whatever label war puts on us. We are always, always human beings first. And that means we always have a choice about how we treat each other, even when, especially when, everything around us is designed to take that choice away." He paused, then added, "And I want them to know that mercy isn't weakness. That moment of mercy gave Dmitri 50 more years of life. It gave him children and grandchildren who would not exist if I had pulled that trigger. Mercy created life. War only knows how to take it." The foxhole that protected Klaus Becker and briefly sheltered Dmitri Volkov is long gone, filled in by time and the countless changes the landscape has undergone since 1943. The exact location is unknown, just one of millions of holes dug into the earth during those brutal years on the Eastern Front. But the story of that hole, and of the two soldiers who found humanity in the most inhumane circumstances, survived. Klaus's testimony is preserved in historical archives. Dmitri's letters are held by his family in Russia and by Klaus's descendants in Germany. The Red Star pin that changed hands in that frozen foxhole is now in a museum in Munich, part of an exhibit about individual stories from the war. In 2003, 60 years after the events in the foxhole, members of both families met in Berlin. Klaus's grandson and Dmitri's granddaughter stood together at the memorial to victims of the war, two young people who existed because of a choice made in a moment of fear and cold, an impossible decision. The German hole that protected only one soldier became for 72 hours a sanctuary for two, and the story that emerged from it reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of mercy echo across decades, creating ripples that reach far beyond what we can imagine in the moment we make our choice. Klaus Becker and Dmitri Volkov are both gone now, as is their generation, the last witnesses to that terrible conflict. But their story remains, a quiet testament to the truth that we are always more than the uniforms we wear or the orders we follow. We are, all of us, simply human beings trying to survive. And sometimes the most important battles we fight are not against each other, but against the forces that would make us forget that fundamental truth.